The large town hall buzzed with tension, the kind of electricity that crackles before a storm. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the room, filled with community members of all ages. On one side, a group holding signs in bold letters. "Protect our future, Anne. No more divisions." On the other, equally passionate faces stood firm, their banners reading, "Fairness first." And "Our town, our rules." At the center of the chaos stood Melania Trump, calm and poised despite the heated debate. She had been invited as a guest speaker to mediate, her reputation as a former First Lady and advocate for children and communities lending weight to the occasion. A man in his 40s, his face flushed with anger, stood and pointed a finger. "What do you know about us?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the room. "You live in luxury. You don't understand what it's like to be in the trenches, struggling to make ends meet, dealing with the consequences of these policies." The room erupted into murmurs, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disapproval. A woman near the back, clutching her young daughter's hand, stood up in response. "That's not fair. She's here to help, not to take sides. At least she's doing something." The tension escalated as voices overlapped, each side growing louder, angrier. Melania raised a hand, her voice cutting through the noise with surprising strength. "Please," she said, her accent soft but commanding, "let us not talk over each other. This is exactly what keeps us divided." The room quieted, though the air remained thick with unease. Melania stepped forward, her expression steady. "I understand your frustrations," she began, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. "I, too, know what it feels like to be misunderstood. I was an immigrant in a new land, far from my family, building a life in a place where I didn't know if I would belong. But I learned something important: we cannot solve problems by shouting at each other. We solve them by listening." The crowd seemed to soften, some crossing their arms but others leaning forward, curious. Melania continued. "We are here because we care about this community, about its families, its future. So, let's not waste this moment fighting each other. Let's use it to find a solution together." A silence settled over the room, heavy but expectant, like the calm after a clap of thunder. All eyes were on her now, waiting to see what would come next. Melania paused, letting the silence settle. She scanned the room, meeting the eyes of those who still seemed skeptical. "I may not live here," she admitted, "but I know what it's like to feel pulled apart by forces bigger than yourself. And I know the pain of watching people I care about grow further apart instead of coming together." Her voice softened, but the conviction in her tone held firm. "Today, I ask you for one thing: to set aside your anger, even just for a moment, and consider this: what kind of town do you want your children to grow up in? One of walls and mistrust, or one of bridges and understanding?" The crowd was quiet now, a few heads bowed in thought. From the back of the room, a younger man with a skeptical smirk raised his hand. "Bridges are great and all, but how? It's easy to talk about unity, but we're here because no one agrees on how to move forward." Melania nodded, her lips curving into a faint, empathetic smile. "That is a fair question," she said. "And the answer does not come from me alone. It comes from all of you. We can start by listening to each other, not as opponents, but as neighbors. By finding the small things we agree on and building from there." A murmur rippled through the room. An older woman in the front row spoke up. "And what if we don't find anything to agree on? What if we're just too different?" Melania's gaze met the woman's, steady and warm. "Differences are not the problem," she said. "It is how we treat each other because of those differences that creates walls. I believe if we focus on what we can do instead of what we can't, we'll discover we are stronger together than apart." A few nods of agreement began to spread. The man who had initially confronted her shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak again. Melania stepped back slightly, gesturing toward the group. "This is your community. The power to change it lies with you. I am here only to help you see that it is possible. Let us use this meeting to begin, not to solve everything, but to take the first step." Who among you will share an idea for how we can start? For a moment, no one spoke. Then, the woman who had defended Melania earlier raised her hand. What about the shelter? She said hesitantly. It's at risk of closing, and everyone knows how important it is to the families who depend on it. Maybe we could focus on saving it. That's something everyone should care about, right? Melania smiled encouragingly. That is a wonderful idea. Can we agree that helping those in need is something worth uniting for? Gradually, hands began to rise across the room. One by one, voices chimed in, offering suggestions, volunteering resources, or simply voicing their support. The tension in the room began to dissolve, replaced by an air of cautious optimism. As the meeting wrapped up, Melania watched as people who had been shouting at each other earlier now exchanged quiet words and tentative smiles. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start, a glimmer of hope in a room that had begun the day divided. Walking out of the town hall, Melania felt a sense of purpose. This was only the beginning, but it proved one thing: even in the face of division, the seeds of unity could take root with the right nurturing. The morning after the town hall, news spread like wildfire. The shelter for displaced families was just weeks away from shutting its doors. It was the only facility of its kind in the area, providing meals, temporary housing, and support to those in need. Melania sat in a small cafe near the town square, her phone buzzing with messages from reporters and well-wishers. A local newspaper lay on the table in front of her, its headline stark: Shelter faces closure amidst community divide. Her brow furrowed as she read the article. It detailed not just the financial troubles of the shelter, but the reluctance of local businesses and leaders to work together to find a solution. The feud between opposing sides of the community had seeped into every corner of Willow Creek, and the shelter was now its latest casualty. Melania knew she had to act. This wasn't just about saving a building, it was about showing the town that unity was possible, even in the face of long-standing mistrust. Later that day, Melania returned to the town hall, where a small group of volunteers had gathered to brainstorm ideas. Among them was the woman from the meeting who had suggested focusing on the shelter. Her name was Clara, and she ran a local bakery known for bringing people together over coffee and pastries. We've tried fundraisers before, Clara said, her voice tinged with worry. But it's hard to get both sides of this town to show up to the same event, let alone work together. Melania placed a reassuring hand on Clara's shoulder. This time will be different, she said. We won't just raise money, we'll create an event that shows people the power of coming together. We'll give them a reason to believe in something bigger than their differences. With Clara's help, Melania reached out to local businesses, churches, and schools, asking for their support. She personally visited the shelter to speak with the staff and families who relied on its services, listening to their stories and sharing their voices in her campaign. Not everyone was on board. Some business owners refused to contribute, citing past conflicts or skepticism about the shelter's impact. A vocal group of community members even accused Melania of using the crisis for her own gain. At a press conference outside the shelter, one reporter asked her directly, "How do you respond to those who say you're only doing this for publicity?" Melania met the question head-on, her expression calm but resolute. "This is not about me," she said firmly. "It is about the families who need our help and the future of this community. If some choose to doubt my intentions, that is their right. But I will not let their skepticism stop me from doing what is right." Her words struck a chord. The next day, a local hardware store owner who had initially refused to help showed up at the shelter with a truck full of supplies. "I still don't know if this will work," he admitted, "but I'm willing to try." The fundraiser was held in the town square on a crisp Saturday afternoon. Booths lined the streets, offering food, crafts, and games donated by local businesses. A stage had been set up for live music, and the shelter's children performed a heartfelt song about hope and resilience. As the event unfolded, something remarkable began to happen. People who had barely spoken to each other in years were now laughing, sharing stories, and working side by side. The energy was infectious, and donations poured in far beyond expectations. Melania stood near the stage, watching as rival business owners shook hands and families from opposing sides of the feud joined together in a dance. Clara approached her, tears glistening in her eyes. "Look at this," she said, her voice breaking. "I never thought I'd see the day." By the end of the event, the shelter had not only raised enough funds to stay open but also gained a network of volunteers and resources to ensure its long-term sustainability. The success of the fundraiser sparked a ripple effect throughout Willow Creek. Inspired by the shelter's story, other community projects began to emerge, new partnerships, joint events, and initiatives that brought people together. At the heart of it all was Melania, who had not only saved a vital resource but had shown the town what was possible when unity triumphed over division. Months later, Melania visited the shelter, now bustling with activity and brimming with hope. She watched as children played in the courtyard and volunteers handed out meals with smiles. Clara joined her, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "You've changed this town," she said softly. Melania shook her head, a small smile on her lips. "No," she replied. "The town changed itself. I just reminded them of what they were capable of." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the shelter, Melania felt a deep sense of peace. In the face of division, they had built something lasting, a bridge strong enough to carry them all.